We have many examples of service from among our participants. We'll now be hearing from some of them who volunteered to tell us about their service. If when hearing their stories, you would like to tell either your story or a close family member's story, we would love to hear from you after our volunteers. And our very first volunteer was Dave. So Dave, come and tell your story, your veteran story.
Okay. There's the ship, one of the ships I was on.
What do they call that kind of ship?
It's in the story.
Okay, good.
It's 1965 and I get a draft notice. I support the war in Vietnam and intend to accept the draft. I have 3 brothers who've accepted military obligations. I figure it's just my time to serve. Before I report, I enlist in the Naval Reserve. It's a 6-year obligation with 2 years of active duty in the fleet. My first year and a half I spend in the Naval Armory Station at Randolph in the Lake in Chicago, training and going to meetings. We muster in formation once a month at the Armory. The newly appointed Cardinal Cody is inspecting the troops. It's publicity stunt for the Navy and the new Cardinal. He passes by the troops with an entourage of TV cameras and reporters when he stands in front of me and asks me, "Son, why did you join the Navy?" I respond, "Well, Your Eminence, they don't have foxholes aboard ships." We both laugh. The producer shouts, "That's a wrap," and the camera and crew leave, but the Cardinal continues to inspect all the troops. That evening, I return home and see myself and the Cardinal on the 10 p.m. news on WGN. We're sharing a hearty laugh. My 15 minutes of fame takes all of 15 seconds of TV time. Upon completing 2 years of active duty, I am compelled to again go to meetings at the Naval Armory. We gather first in formation for muster. There are a few hundred enlisted troops there. Half of them are veterans and the other half have yet to go on active duty. There's a formal request for my presence before the commander at the head of the formation. I walk up nervously in perfect military step and present myself with a salute. The commander presents me with a medal, a Secretary of the Navy unit citation for meritorious service under fire and accomplishment of objectives. It reads like I did this all myself, but it's given to the ship and all the crew. They present this publicly in front of the troops to impress primarily the recruits who have yet to go on active duty, something for them to look forward to. Between these two events, I spent 2 years in active duty in the regular Navy. The first 6 months are spent in electronic schools in San Diego and San Francisco. This is great duty, some real intellectual challenges with testing and performance mandates, and at the same time, great cities to investigate and enjoy their sites and their people on weekends. Immediately after graduation, I get orders and sea duty aboard the Clarion River LSMR 409. It's a flat-bottomed rocket ship. It's basically an ammunition locker for about 4,500 rockets. I fly to the Philippines, to Subic Bay Naval Base, to meet my new duty station. Before we leave for Vietnam, we are tasked with reloading the ship with 4,500 rockets. This operation takes in all-hands working party, 18 hours of passing rockets hand to hand. These rockets weigh 80 pounds, and this must be done at sea at the edge of the bay, away from everything. There is a dangerous operation. If someone drops a rocket, most of them manufactured for the Second World War, who knows what might blow up? The hardest working day of my life, at least until that point. When we finish, we are off to 3 months tour on the shores and rivers of Vietnam. This flat bottom boat was made for shallow water transport, then converted to a rocket ship, redesigned for the invasion of Japan to end the Second World War, and then redesigned again. It's a small boat with 8 rocket launchers and a 5-inch gun on the main deck. Our job, patrol the harbor, rivers, and shores of Vietnam. We arrive off Vietnam a few days before Christmas of 1967. We celebrate Christmas 4 or 5 sailors at a time on the main deck with a shot of whiskey as a treat and reason to be thankful. It's cold on the main deck, a weather deck, and rainy. You can see the Vietnam shore not far in a distance. We haven't fired a shot yet, and all I can think of is, what the hell am I doing here? My first job is at the relay station on the phone as a phone talker, relaying firing orders to the rocket launcher stations. I don't know procedures, language, jargon, and usage, and am soon moved below decks to a rocket launcher room. I transfer an arm, then load the rocket launcher. Hard work, and you can't see a thing. It's a small room, stinks of expended rocket fuel, but you're soon too exhausted to care. We are firing at an enemy we cannot see and will be evaluated by the number of KIAs or kills we count up. The rumor is to embellish that number, water buffalo and cattle are counted also. It just might be that the nature of reporting of the war is more important than the nature of doing the war. My military special is electronics with a focus on radar. I move on to Combat Information Center, leaving the launcher room behind. CIC and the electronics shack become my new home. CIC, or Combat Information Center, is the operations and intelligence hub of the ship. We spend the next few months in shallow waterbed, firing rockets in support of troops without a day off until we run out of rockets and return to Japan, Yokosuka, Japan, our home port. We will reform, repair, and rearm and return to Vietnam, all within 2 or 3 months. But I get orders to report to an LST, landing ship Tanks, on its way to join the battle group we just left in Vietnam, back to the mobile riverine forces. This LST is another flat bottom boat that travels up and down the Mekong Delta River with a fleet of small boats. A battle group able to enter the smallest tributaries in pursuit of the enemy, or are they just locals going about their normal day? That is what they are tasked to find out. We will, as a single force, travel up and down the Mekong Delta River, which is about the size of our Mississippi River, all the way to Cambodia, where we will lay down mines, and back down the river to Vung Tau, a resort town, to the point it empties into the ocean. We will remain at this job site for about 3 months, but the time we leave, we will be showering in river water, treated with an antibiotic, but it stinks and we learn full of detoxins or Agent Orange. That will end up killing some of us later as civilians. I will be separated from active duty in 1969, just in time to see Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That was wonderful. That was really great. It's, you know, you don't get very many personal stories from people who have done what you've done.
First time I wrote it up or thought that thoroughly about it, I guess, and I enjoyed the effort. I mean, thank you.
Good, good. Thank you. Our next volunteer was David Winter.
Okay. Yeah, my service in the U.S. Army. Of my family of 5 siblings, 4 of us served in one or another branch of the U.S. military. I was drafted to serve in the U.S. Army in May of 1956 and honorably discharged 2 years later in May of 1958. My service began with 8 weeks of basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and continued with 8 weeks of advanced training also in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in what was known as clerk typist school. I think I was able to type 70 words a minute without making a mistake. I don't know if any of you remember onion skin and carbon papers, but that was a real pain, especially if you made a mistake. So
And erase all those copies.
all those different copies. Yeah, it was crazy. Yes, my next assignment was to Fort MacArthur, California, a very small post located in San Pedro near Long Beach, California. It was my first ride on an airplane. My job was chief clerk, and I shared an office with the first sergeant of the company. One of my duties was to keep duty rosters for such things as KP, funeral details, forest fire details, and so on. The best thing about the job was that I didn't have to do any of these things myself. I just assigned the other people. I remember that I was the one that taught soldiers on funeral details how to fold the flag to make the perfect triangle that we all are familiar with. I was also frequently called upon to be the driver for the company commander, Major Charles Peckham, a former POW, and his wife to various events, which once included a ballroom where Lawrence Welk was playing. Fort MacArthur served as a transfer point for soldiers returning from Korea and other places. A lot of my friends were also clerks in other offices. A couple of my friends from New York were big into theater and thought our group should put on a play. We were initially met with a lot of opposition from senior officers. Then someone found out that the town of San Pedro wanted to build a new hospital and thought that of suggesting that Fort MacArthur could be a part of the fundraising effort by putting on this play. Suddenly, the post commander and the senior officers liked the idea and got on board with lots of support, including a truck with a driver to get sets, curtains, and costumes from Hollywood and so forth. And an old theater on post that had been closed was spruced up and refurbished, and we performed the play "The Love of Four Colonels." And I still have the program book from that event. It was a lot of fun. It was one of the highlights of my career, of fun things to do. Love of Four Colonels. I also got to attend 2 Rose Bowl parades during my 2 years in California. So that was kind of neat. Being one of the closest military bases to Hollywood, we were frequently called upon to supply soldiers for shows and often given tickets to premiere some movies that involved the military. A movie with Jerry Lewis was filmed on our post, and we got to see a lot of him. And I have 3 or 4 pictures of him in here. And this is a picture of one of my friends that appeared on Truth or Consequences. And of course, it was a surprise. They brought his wife in from Pennsylvania, and apparently they weren't getting along very well. So it was almost an embarrassment that he went through it. What? Yeah, I think they separated after he got out of the army, but it was quite an event. And these were a couple of movie premieres that I got to. Heaven Knows Mr. Allison.
Oh,
Anybody
neat.
remember
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Heaven Knows It. And Tea House of the August Moon.
Oh, yeah.
Another one. And there's a Rose Bowl ticket, so forth. And a bunch of pictures of Jerry Lewis, if you want. There's some.
Yeah, so come
So-
over and take a look at his pictures.
Yeah. So, thank you. I think, where did I leave off? Yeah. After I was discharged, I kept in touch with maybe 15 of my Army friends with Christmas cards, phone calls, and things like that. One who lived in Sarasota died about a month ago, leaving only one who now lives in Park Ridge that I expect to see soon. So,
Oh, thank you.
thank you.
Okay, I'm going to tell you about my brother. And my brother in that picture is the young man on the far left. I had 3 brothers and they all served in the Army, but I'm only going to be telling you about my oldest brother, Al. His real name was Clarence Alfred, and he was a junior. So we called him Al. Al was drafted into the Army shortly after the end of World War II. He had just started college with the intent to become a doctor and fulfill my father's greatest desire that he become a doctor. He was a smart guy, and I guess the Army thought so too, as they trained him to be an undercover detective. He was put to work to uncover black market activity related to the Marshall Plan's food distribution in France and Germany. He moved around between France and Germany and checks the Army's distribution centers and to see that the food was going to the people and not to the black marketeers, because I don't know if you remember, right after World War II, Europe was starving because they couldn't do their farming because of the war. So that was his job, to try to uncover black market food activity. At the time, he really couldn't tell us exactly what his duty was because it was secret and undercover, so he couldn't tell us. But many years afterwards, he told us what he did during his service and why he couldn't tell us at the time, as it was too dangerous for those who did this kind of work. After his service, he went back to college and eventually did become a doctor, although not a medical doctor as my father desired, but got his doctorate in electrical engineering because my father was an electrical engineer. He was always a good brother to me and throughout my life. He died in 2013 and I miss him very much. He was a good brother. Okay, Dr. Bill, you've had your respite now. Now it's your turn.
I was never able to follow up on that. When my turn came, I decided I did not believe in the war in Vietnam. I had a very low draft number, so I chose a medical direction. I ended up years later at the NIH. I worked as a research postdoctoral fellow at NIH for 3 years doing molecular genetics. And as the time wore on, it turned out that being in the public health service had a sort of a military shroud around it. You didn't go somewhere with a rifle, but they told me I had been a second lieutenant the whole time. So that's my military service. And I guess I am eligible for some benefits, although I haven't explored that too much.
I don't know how to get this on with my ponytail. The first document that you see is a letter from the Human Resource Department of Marshall Field to the Department of the Navy, suggesting that the Navy would be better served if my father didn't go to submarine school. And I don't know if that was because he was claustrophobic or terrified of water and didn't know how to swim. But it also notes by the head of human resources in the letter that he was reliable, dependable, and had great common sense. He spent his life as a salesman. And the final sentence in the letter requesting the Navy assign him elsewhere said he had a great sense of humor. And anybody that knew my dad would say that, and I think that's why he was successful in sales. So he was recruited on December 14th, 1942, and went to shopkeepers training. So he was working for Fields, and through that recommendation was assigned to an R&R base on the Clyde River in Glasgow, a shipbuilding yard, and they were stationed at Roseneath Castle in Roseneath, Scotland, outside of Glasgow. So that's where he had his picture taken in full tartan dress, which is in the upper left-hand corner. That appeared in the Presbyterian Home newsletter. I learned because he was 32, and as the younger men were going into World War II and falsifying their age to go to war, he was called Pops. I never knew that until I read this article. So at the shopkeepers school, as a shopkeeper on a rest and recreation base, he was either outfitting the men coming back from Europe to be re-outfitted to go home to the United States. His troop ship was the Queen Mary, and some of the soldiers were going back to the front. One of his favorite activities was organizing Sunday afternoon teas at the home of Mrs. Short. He slept in what he called the cook and baker's tent. So he negotiated sugar and flour rations for Mrs. Short to make goodies so that the Navy lads could get to know the local girls. And one of those local girls, Betty Short, married a Canadian officer, and senior Mrs. Short actually came shortly after the war because she was coming to visit her daughter, met my grandmother who entertained her, and I later in life got to meet Betty when she came to the United States. So I heard these stories my whole life. What you see in the corner is a piece of heather. My father sent this card to his sister, and there's a lovely poem that's incorporated with that. And the picture of my dad as a swabby was in Field Notes, the Marshall Fields in-house newsletter. Dad was, and in that little article, it says, my dad is inquiring about the athletic programs at Fields. He was literally recruited to work at Marshall Fields. If he sold something, fine. His job was to win baseball games in the Grant Park League because he played on the 1929 Lane Tech City Champs team against the New York City Champs in Wrigley Field. And I have a gold watch fob that Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, playing for the Sox that day, came over to present to all the boys, and I have a baseball with those signatures on it. I am not his favorite daughter. My down the block girlfriend played softball until she was 49, now suffering badly and needing knees replaced. But I had his Navy softball glove and I lost it at a Lassie League game and I was afraid to come home. And the last thing my dad did before he passed away in July of '98 was to go see Julie play a game in Grant Park. So I have many, many fond memories of this association with Scotland and with my dad's service and how so many different things tied together. And I have a great respect for everything that the veterans have done for us. And I hope we can help any veterans that need help. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. Eva, would you like to tell your story?
I would.
Come up here where we can hear you and the people at home can hear you.
Yeah. I belong to this group at the church here called Storytelling.
Otherwise, we see your stomach and not your
Oh.
face.
I'm sorry. And you don't look at that. It's called Storytelling, and we're giving different prompts each week, and we can write anything concerning that prompt. And a year ago, we were giving the prompt Veterans Day. So I wrote about my brother. I have never participated in a public Veterans Day celebration, but it has heartfelt meaning to me. I had a brother 2 years older than me who enlisted in the Air Force after high school graduation. I think his enlistment was for 2 years, and when his duty time was down to 6 months, he was told he would go to Vietnam. A jolt for us, his family, as well as to him. Being the brave young man he was, of course, he went, no questions asked. His family was sad because of all the, what do I have here? I got 2 pages. Because of all the horrible things that were happening in Vietnam. So many wonderful young men lost their lives. He was stationed in Da Nang and he worked in a mechanic shop. He wrote to me, to my mother and dad, our mother and dad, and to our favorite aunt who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Because he had never been a letter writer, we knew that he was concerned, maybe even scared for his life. He wrote about bombings and how all the people in the shop had to get undercover, and about how it was to sleep at night, how hard it was to sleep at night because they never knew when the next bombing would happen. Well, 6 to 8 months later, he came home. Not the same easygoing, nice guy who could fix anything or help out anyone with their problems. He was notably nervous and had some digestive problems, and he seemed anxious. The war had definitely affected his body and soul. He also did not want to talk about the war. He sort of kept it all inside. He did adjust, and then he went to a trade school for some mechanical program and worked at a gas station to support himself. The school was in Denver, Colorado, and I moved to Denver about the time he graduated. However, while working at the gas station, he became friends with a man who was a managing partner of the Mr. Steak restaurant chain. Well, this man saw all the potential skills my brother had and hired him as some sort of an account manager. I don't know the title. But he would go to restaurants that were having trouble and help them get up and running again profitably. Chuck would roll up his sleeves and cook with the cooks in the kitchen. He helped redesign menus. He even helped hire people. He would spend 4 to 6 weeks with each restaurant. He was loved by many more than his family. I think of him often and wish he was still with us. But he is why I take Veterans Day so seriously.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. He is a great guy.
And we have one more. Anne Marie, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? During World War II, I was like 7, 8 years old. And I want to begin my story, which is about my first cousin, by saying that during World War II, here in the United States, everyone was a part of the war effort. You had women saving their bacon grease in cans and giving it to the meat market. Now, I don't really think they used it in the war, but they let people think that they did. We had little stamps you could buy at the post office, and you put them in a book so you could buy a savings bond. You also had rationing for sugar and butter and flour and shoes, and everyone was really involved in the war. Now, that said, my father's sister lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and my cousins were much older than me. And my Aunt Delia had her son Jack, her daughter Pat, her son Frank, her daughter-in-law, and her son-in-law, all in the military. Now, I'm going to tell you about my cousin Jack. Jack was in the Army, and he was sent to Germany. And they were told that they were to look for this German spy. And they went out into the countryside, and there was this old house. And they were told that the spy was in the house. Now, when they got to the house, there was an old lady sitting outside, and she looked very harmless. So most of them just ignored her, went in, and were going up the stairs looking for this spy. When all of a sudden, my cousin, who was at the end of the line, felt some breath on his neck. And when he turned around, it was the old lady, and she was the spy. And they captured her. And as I understand the story, they took her and into jail. And I guess it was common in those days for German spies to put cyanide capsules under their skin. And if they were caught, they would crack it, and then they would die from the cyanide rather than having to go to trial. Many of the spies really escaped from Germany, went to Mexico and to South America. And today you have a lot of German communities in both Mexico, Central and South America. The other thing I'd like to tell you about the war was when it ended in August. My Aunt Delia was a very strong woman. She could rule the roost, and you rarely would find anyone trying to cross her. But like I told you, she had a lot of her family in the Navy, in the military. And when the war ended in August, I was visiting up in St. Paul. And I remember my aunt sitting down when she heard it on the radio that the truce had been found, had happened. And she just wept with gratitude, wept with relief, just was so happy that that war was over. And my experience of her seeing the end of the war really helped me to understand how hard it was on the families of people who go to war in any war. When I was a young adult, I remember the Vietnam War, and I was against the war, and I protested the war, and I was with civil rights. And I think that kind of beginning to appreciate the patriotic stance of our country really is with me right now today, as I am really concerned that many people will not vote on November 8th. And we really need to get out the vote to save our democratic republic. Thank you.
Francis? Francis, over here,
Say something.
video,
Who,
on video,
yes, could you say your name again, please?
Louise.
Hi, Louise. Did you have a story to tell us?
I just had a comment. I didn't know you could do family members, or I would have done more research on this. My brother was in the Air Force for 30 years. He exited as a Chief Master Sergeant, and he was transferred all over the United States. He was in charge of missile maintenance on the bases he was at. And I'm sure that he had stories to tell. I didn't know that. I thought just the active duty people or people that had served could talk. So I just wanted to say he was very active in that and totally believed in the military, of course.
Oh, thank you for contributing.
Welcome.